Hi, and welcome to Storytime. The story I'm sharing with you today is a bit of a confession and also an invitation. We've been exploring the study of tapas this month. And tapas from the yogic tradition is that fire, that heat that facilitates transformation and growth, often confused with the idea of pushing through and enduring through all trials and tribulations. But really, we want to cultivate a wisdom to be complemented into that effort, that discipline, that focus, that perseverance, in order to honor ahimsa, the compassion, as well as satya, the truth of what our conditions in our life may be presenting. So it may not be news to you, but I have a bit of a habit of overworking, right? I'm a bit of a pitta imbalanced individual, despite all sorts of practices and tendencies that I have cultivated in the years since embracing yoga that have actually helped improve matters quite a bit. So I no longer crash and burn. And yet, one of the strategies that has been super helpful for me is the story I want to share with you today. The story of how I cultivate tapas is by intentionally taking a break. So this will be our final story time for this season. And what do I mean by that? This season, meaning that I'm going to take some time off this summer from both coaches chat and story time so that I can refill myself, redirect my own energy to my inner study in order to begin again in September. I do something very similar in December. I take a couple of weeks off from running and managing the studio so that again in January we can begin again. This has become the pattern of my scheduling, and it's reminiscent of the years that I spent in academy, in the academic institution, meaning the education system. Whereas summers are the time for restructuring, right? Summers as a child, of course, were time off away from school, but administrators and educators are reformulating. But in that reformulating, they're shifting their energy. And I, working in education for so many years, loved the summertime because I got to do big thinking and planning and strategizing, getting refueled from the play and the freedom of summer in order to begin again when students would arrive back on campus in August. Now, I still like to work with that academic schedule. And in a sense, I kind of run my studio and my life in a similar way of having terms or semesters, so to speak. The fall semester, September, October, November, with a mini break to then return for January, February, and March. I try to get at the end of March, somewhere in that range, another short reset for myself, a mini vacation. We call it spring break in the academic world, but it's really a way to keep our own sources filled before they get completely depleted. So in the last 2.5+ years, that schedule has been a bit manipulated because of the COVID pandemic. Not just getting COVID and being forced into isolation for 10 days, but also the initial separation, the social distancing that we were asked to practice as a way of helping to keep us safer, protect us from unintended transmission. Well, that introspection may or may not have been accessed for many because of the fear that shows up. In other words, fear that drives us into distance, whether that's a disconnect or removal, can often result in loneliness. That separation is not an introspection invitation. It's not a place for healing and restoring. It ends up being a place of friction and often pain and suffering. So my question for all of us, and perhaps my invitation, is to consider, when was the last time you found a safe, broad space, energetically, physically, for rest and decompression, for play and for healing, not from an illness, but from the fatigue of everyday living? If all we do is the same thing, A, B, C, A, B, C, A, B, C, all day long, every day, we can bring in some inspiration by reversing, by reorganizing ABC into BCA or BAC, by changing things up a bit. Now, for me, that's a strategy that I use every day. No day is ever the same pattern, but that's both the privilege of owning and operating as a yoga therapist, but it's also the joy, the blessing, it's the burden and the blessing of working in an environment like yoga service. Whereas those who might work at a desk job, your days might have a lot more routine, a lot more consistency. So the challenge may be increased for you to bring in inspiration into your day. And in that same space, sometimes vacations are easier to come by if you're on a salary system or you're on a scheduled system of having time away. As a self-employed entrepreneur, I am solely responsible for carving out my time away. And again, as a bit of a workaholic, that can be quite difficult. For the past few years, I've had on my calendar that I take the entire month of August off. Close down my outpouring of service. And every year thus far, it has gotten shorter and shorter and shorter and shorter. One year, I was successful and took 3 weeks off. Went on an extended family traveling vacation. We caravan, we drove the west coast of the United States from north of Seattle down to about San Francisco. We didn't make it all the way down to Los Angeles or the Baja. That might have to happen another day. But what I learned in that 3-week pause of my regular life, I was so rejuvenated and restored by immersing myself in my highest values, that is spending time with my family, being outdoors and experiencing new things, but also honoring my own schedule of when to rise and when to sleep and when to have deep conversations and when to have internal introspection, and finding a new rhythm during that time off. Then I could come back to my regular day, my regular life, renewed and restored with clarity to do what needs to be done next. And it's often in that transition where I bloom forth with ideas, with plans and projects and big ambitions. And in some ways that can be quite overwhelming to come back with all these big plans. And so in some ways I have to temper that, to let them digest, let them ferment, if you will, to find that sense of clarity. And that has come with time. The more that I do this practice of taking time away in order to return renewed, I've found less fear that if I don't implement immediately, it will be for naught. And instead, I let this time away build upon each other so that when I do come to that place of sharing, I do so with a greater sense of confidence, competence, access to compassion, what is doable without causing harm, and conviction that I move forward, that clarity that this is the next expression of my own becoming. So what's the story here? The story is, what are the patterns? What are the habits that are working for you? Story time is about sharing those stories and then integrating the lessons of these stories to help us to live better, to live well, to live intimately with prana, yoga living. And for me, that means I schedule time away. It was built into my academic schedule, and having worked and immersed myself into the academies for so many years, it was almost second nature. It wasn't until I left the university, I left my career in higher education and moved over to corporate, that I missed the built-in measuring of time of semesters and summer break. And now all of a sudden it felt more like I was on a continual hamster wheel, right? Just running, never really creating those milestone moments of pause to see where we've been and to choose wisely where I was going next. So where are you As Jessica Jar says, we begin where we are and how we are. So there's no need to cultivate a shame or a sense of disappointment for not having this mindfulness in your practice. But where are you now? And here's the invitation. Do you see in your calendar the next space that you have carved out, a day, a weekend, a month, that is just for your intentional self-care, to practice the values that mean the most to you? It might be a vacation. It might be a staycation. It might be going on retreat or even investing in some training, something that's going to feed your spirit in a way that's going to broaden your perspective and focus your attention to what matters most. So no matter where that needs to happen, you want it to be within the horizon. Too far off and it doesn't motivate us to keep going, knowing that that's coming, that that rest is coming. And too close, we may not be prepared to take full advantage. But the journey in between, that bardos, that becoming in between, is to make sure that that respite is soon enough that we don't get burned out and need that respite just to recover, but that we can use that for deepening our relationship with self-care and intimacy, deepen our relationship with our own true self, not just recover from the burden of being in our regular everyday life. So for me, that means every 3 to 4 months, I create an extra long weekend or some extra quiet where I close off my open schedule for one-on-one work and I do more introspection. This happens in December at the end of the year when I revisit my life's work plan and prepare for the new year, the beginning again with intentions and vision board and revising my plan as needed by the time March rolls around. Then I work through the spring, right? Summer, take another break to reflect on my plan, to reflect on where my energy is going, and restore a little bit with something new and playful. Not surprising, perhaps, today I enrolled in my next training program, the one that I will participate in, and I'm super excited. Now, it doesn't start until August, which is good because then I've got some time to truly prepare. But once I've made that decision and added it to my calendar, now I have an anticipation. I'm looking forward to that in hope and in joy. And I've planned it far enough, well enough, that it's not going to be forgotten, but it's also not going to be anxious, right? Anxiety provoking, as in if I'm not ready. And that too can be a hurdle that we can only experiment with trial and error to find the timing and the pattern that works for us. As I said, for me, it's about every 3 to 4 months, but at least once a year, I try to get that into a longer, deeper dive, whether that's in training, in retreat, or in vacation with my family and loved ones. That can vary for me from year to year, but finding that bigger space is not unlike tickling the edge of time in our meditation or tickling the edge of effort in our vinyasa movement practice. Finding that edge, tickling that edge, that's what keeps us vibrant and intimately connected to spanda, to prana. Spanda is the pulsation, prana is that energy force. And that to me is living well. But it begins with practicing kindness and compassion, self-care, and planning our activities to honor and enable that kind of deep self-care. From there, we can support and love one another a little more freely and a little less regret or burden. And that to me is another whole layer of knowing when perhaps I'm a little overwhelmed, when doing the things feels like, oh, I have to do these things again. It's a red flag for me. It's a time to turn in. It's a time to nourish. It's a time to heal and recover so that I can give freely from abundance, from love. So I will see you, I hope, here again for story time when we resume in September. And in the meantime, play, learn, explore, have an adventure because I want to hear all about it. That's how you create the stories, the richness of connection. So have your experience and then come back and we'll share our experiences so that we can learn from one another and learn about one another. Take care of you. Take care of those around you. We are truly in this together. May you breathe deeply and move freely. May you labor lovingly and live vibrantly. Namaste. Be well, and I'll see you in September. Namaste.